I wish we had time to read all 5 chapters of today's Torah portion, because they are so powerful and important to forming a set of guidelines for us to live by. The Torah portion name is Ki Tetzeh, which means when you go out to war. However, war is just a fraction of what these passages discuss. And as I prepared this lesson, I wondered, how am I ever going to find the words to explain the profound and far-reaching impact of these laws of God to modern-day believers? And perhaps more importantly, how are we to think about applying these ancient laws to our modern individual lives on a practical level? We have a series of commands that are most difficult for our modern Western minds to accept. Take, for example, the first one that we encounter in Deuteronomy 21:10. When you go out to war against your enemies, and Adonai your God hands them over to you, and you take prisoners, and you see among the prisoners a woman who looks good to you, and you feel attracted to her, and you want her as your wife, you are to bring her home to your house, where she will shave her head, cut her fingernails, and remove her prison clothing. She will stay there in your house, mourning her father and mother for a full month, after which you may go in to have sexual relations with her and be her husband, and she will be your wife. Now, this command sounds strange. It's not cruel and unjust to us. So how are we as believers supposed to understand and obey this in the 21st century? The first rule for the interpretation of the ancient texts is to interpret and understand them within the historical and cultural context in which they were written. We must not judge a text that was written over 3,000 years ago based against the cultural standards and worldview of the 21st century in the West. If we do this, we will misunderstand. We will misapply what it tells us, and that basic error is what drives the bulk of Christian doctrine as we find it today. When we read the Torah and we see this command, we might be filled with self-righteous indignation. But consider instead the spirit and the God principle underlying it. Males will always be able to physically dominate females due to our God-given biological makeup. So the command is that a male soldier is not to ravage a female on the enemy on the enemy side on account of war. If a man is that attracted to her, he must take her as his wife and care for her appropriately. Not just take her, use her, then kill her, or take her as a sex slave, as various factions of Islam continue to do to this day. The Torah limits a male's rights over a woman captive, or over women in general, and actually demands the man control his urges and instincts. He must respect the human rights of the female captive and protect her dignity. The law continues that only after the passing of a month may an Israelite warrior take her as his wife and then have sexual relations with her should marriage be the result. She's not obligated to consent to this. There's no ancient law either before or contemporary with the Torah that takes such a high road toward the female victims who are captives of war. Yet God's Torah takes this law even further. If this woman, after being a month in the soldier's home, refuses to become his wife and doesn't like him, he's not to defile her. Instead, she must be given her freedom to go and do whatever she likes. She's a free woman, cannot be forced to be either the man's slave or concubine. There's no such thing as this law that is this gracious in any country of the ancient world, not even in the minds of much of the world today, especially the Muslim parts of the world. And by the way, Islam is seeking to make the modern Western world accept their ways of dealing with women by insisting that their religious freedom means that our societies are to accept Sharia law for them. And this goal is for this to become the law of the land for every person and every nation they settle in. Now, our Creator has provided us with a perfectly just and righteous law code on how we are to deal with our fellow humans, male and female, even when taking into account the issue of slavery in Bible times and the rules and limitations that the Torah places on a slave owner. Okay, the compassion found in the Torah of Moses was far above the rules of society in Egypt, Babylon, Greece, or Rome. But the Torah goes beyond only how humans are to deal justly with other humans. It also deals with how we are to deal with God's other creatures, because we are indeed able to dominate them. In chapter 22, we read a command that is specifically regarding birds. It's an example meant for us to learn that we are to actively protect and preserve God's lesser creatures. Deuteronomy 22, 6-7. If as you are walking along, you happen to see a bird's nest in a tree or on the ground with chicks or eggs, and the mother bird is sitting on the chicks or the eggs, you're not to take the mother with the chicks. You must let the mother go. But you may take the chicks for yourself. This is so things will go well with you and you will prolong your life. I mean, these laws were given by God to Israel long before there was any real societal or political sensitivity to nature or ecology. In fact, the command for humans to be good stewards over God's lesser creatures goes back even further than the law, to the time of God's creation of Adam and Eve, because this is a principle of life itself. In Genesis 1:26, then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image and the likeness of ourselves. Let them rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the animals over all the earth, over every crawling creature that crawls on the earth." Yet humans, including God worshippers, have ignored this command. And as a result, according to the 2019 Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services by IPBES, the biomass of wild mammals, has fallen by 82%. Natural ecosystems have lost about half their area. Millions of species are at risk of extinction, all largely as a result of humans unjustly disregarding the value of the creatures we share this planet with. Now remember, the Torah was written over 3,000 years ago in a world that had no sensitivity to nature or the preservation of species or to biodiversity. In other words, the Torah is not an outdated law made for an ancient people. It was actually way ahead of its time. And I submit it is even ahead of our time. We, especially as the Hebrew roots segment of believers, should therefore not view our goal as trying to resurrect the Torah, as much as we should think of it as trying to catch up to the enlightenment of it. So far, what I've highlighted doesn't even amount to the tip of the iceberg. Okay, this is one of those places in the Bible that is akin to a major highway intersection, because it is where so much comes together, where one must decide which direction to take in all its possibilities. And when a new annual Torah portion reading cycle begins starting in Genesis 1:1, it takes nearly a full year to get to the point we are at in Torah. A long road must necessarily be traveled, much understanding developed, so that some of the more challenging underlying concepts that spread out and engulf this section of the Torah can properly illuminate us. See, my challenge in teaching Torah has always been how many layers of the onion to peel back at any given moment before enough's enough and it's time to move on. This Torah portion is especially difficult to know what to pick from to discuss out of the many equally important principles and commands being presented. Now, part of that difficulty is in how to deal with this part of Moses' sermon in a way that isn't so off-putting to our Western sensibilities, that our ears simply close to it, especially as the matter of human sexuality becomes front and center. You know, the Gentile translators of the Old Testament as we read it today were for the most part refined urban Europeans. And they brought with them the reserved and puritanical European Christian mindset, as well as a not-so-hidden disdain for all things Jewish. Therefore, most of the frank sexual content that is inherent in God's Word is greatly masked, and we miss it. You know, if we were to categorize the main topics of this portion, there would probably be 4 in number: holy war, sex and family, care for the poorest and most vulnerable, and general humanitarian concerns. All of this revolves around the issue of loving our fellow man, our neighbor. But I think another way to look at it is that God is instructing Israel on the fundamental fairness in all elements of life, dealing with God's created creatures that we are likely to encounter or to affect in some way on this earth. This matters even when it comes to fairness in war, when inevitably there will be victors and vanquished. Now, we discussed the matter of righteous justice last week. And one product of justice is to be fairness. And when we think about fairness, biblically, it's one of the virtues that we are to adopt in our lives as godly people. You know, it's rather comical that fairness is perhaps the earliest virtue that becomes important to us from the time we were very young children. And who among us didn't have tears running down our cheeks as youth when we complained to our parents of the unfairness of something we have to do that our brother or sister doesn't have to do, or that they got to do that we didn't? My wife reminds me of how unfair she thought it that she always had to do the dishes, but her younger brother never did. Or I recall when I was very young, the unfairness that my younger brother received as a birthday gift a dazzling pair of chromed and ivory-handled cap pistols, complete with embossed leather holsters, a gun belt, even with spare fake bullets, something which I didn't have, but greatly coveted it. I doubt any of us have to search our memories very hard to come up with a few instances of when we thought things were unfair to us. And these have stayed with us all of our days. The matter of fairness seems to take on more and more importance in everyday life as we get older. In fact, I would dare say that fundamental fairness plays a role up to and including international politics. So now, for the $64,000 question, how do we define and determine what's fair? What's not fair as we deal with not only the worldwide community of humans, but other living species as well. And especially as believers, it's our duty to look to God as the definer of fairness. In today's Torah portion, he tells us what's fair in war, in sexual relations between men and women, in the family, in dealing with lesser creatures, and in society in general, especially as it concerns the poorest and the most vulnerable. When God tells us what is fair, he is telling us what is righteous. And in telling us what is righteous, he is telling us what is moral. Therefore, fairness is directly connected to morality. Fairness is not about our preferences, although it seems most of the time our own preferences become the basis for deciding it. Fairness, according to God, is the proper outward expression of morality. In God's eyes, fairness is not optional, nor is it customizable. Individual by individual, fair is good, unfair is wicked. So fundamental fairness is far more a matter of obedience to God's commandments than merely how to best settle a squabble among children arguing over the use of a toy, or who goes first in the game, or even as an issue of niceness and politeness. It's most interesting how fairness is the battle cry of so many special interest or identity groups in the modern West. It's not fair that one group of workers gets to work remotely, but another must report to an office. It's not fair that two men or two women who love each other can't be deemed among everyone in society as legitimately married and the union considered as a good and healthy thing that ought to be applauded not only by us, but by God and the church. It's not fair that a CEO of a large company can make $20 million a year, but so many of the company's workers make barely over minimum wage. It's not fair that your kid can be homeschooled or go to a private school, but my kid has to attend public school because I don't make as much money as you do, or I'm a single parent household and therefore can't homeschool. On and on it goes. So why is it that in every one of these issues and hundreds more, there are two opposing sides that can't agree on what's fair? Shouldn't we all be able to agree on a universal standard of fairness? This matter of fairness used to be argued and debated maybe in the arena of politics, but now it has bled over into the arena of religion. How is it that two God worshippers can see an issue of fairness in any or all of these matters in totally opposite ways? It's because each are operating on their own definition of fairness. The objective standard of morality, and therefore of fairness, has been abolished by the church. And it was redefined countless times in secular society over the centuries. And since God demands fundamental fairness, then how do we know what it is? How to achieve it? As a person who was raised in the church, fairness was dealt with according to one simple principle, something that was called the Golden Rule. That rule was, do unto others as you would have it done unto you. This was said to embody the new one rule law that Christ gave to his followers: love. Now, on the surface, this sounds good. Sadly, however, this proverb about fairness must have a context, or it can't be carried out. Where did this Christian proverb come from? We actually do find it in the Bible, in the book of Matthew. However, as happens so very often within Christendom, only part of a passage is quoted from the pulpit. Then it's lifted out of its context in order to validate a man-made doctrine. Here is Yeshua's full quote in Matthew from the well-known, widely used NAS Bible version. Matthew 7:12. Therefore, however you want people to treat you, so treat them, for this is the law and the prophets. The complete Jewish Bible says it more or less the same. Always treat others as you would like them to treat you. That sums up the teaching of the Torah and the prophets. Odd, isn't it, that only the first half of this verse is quoted and enshrined as a Christian doctrine? Even as a doctrine of Western society in general, but the remainder of that same verse is left out and it's utterly unknown. That is, how we are to treat others in a way that we expect in return, how we are to determine what is fair, is, according to Yeshua, expressed where? In the law of Moses and the prophets. No wonder a few verses earlier in Matthew 5:17 through 19, Christ reminded his listeners as he spoke a Sermon on the Mount, he didn't come to abolish the Torah or the prophets, because if he'd done that, it would have involved a complete change of standard of what had been fair and moral from the moment of creation to the day that he spoke that message to thousands of people on a hill above the Sea of Galilee. Thus, according to Yeshua, there is indeed an enduring objective standard that Yehovah has given to his followers that gets very specific about what fairness is and is not. And since the law of Moses is God's divinely given code of morality for humanity, we cannot escape two facts. First, fairness and morality are essentially cut from the same cloth and they can't be separated. And second, we cannot know. We can't carry out God's standard of fairness and morality unless we know and obey the Torah and the prophets. Now, because the Constantinian church established in the 4th century AD was designed to overthrow the faith that Yeshua and the apostles originally taught in exchange for a new Gentile religion consisting of man-made doctrines, then at that moment, the God-ordained standard for fairness and morality was also overthrown. And a new, ever-evolving man-made standard was instituted. A standard that, as history has proven, is no standard at all. A standard that is originally given in the Torah was objective, completely rational, was exchanged for a subjective standard that is inevitably evolved into irrationality, and therefore has splintered into hundreds of factions and belief systems, because that's exactly what subjectivity will always do. For instance, our Torah portion today addresses fairness in war. That, of course, has been replaced by the human-created Geneva Convention. That is regularly amended. Next, the fairness of what happens in war as concerns captured women is addressed, and God says those women are to be treated with respect and dignity, not used as disposable sex toys, and they have human rights that are to be carefully guarded and observed. After that, the issue switches to love and marriage and continues with fairness between a man who has two wives. One is the most loved, the other the least loved, but that has to have no bearing on the status of the children born to them as regards the firstborn designation and rights. And this is all important because this directly affects the economic status that this woman will about, especially when her husband dies. Then fairness of how to deal with a son who is a rebel, refuses to accept his duties as a son and a man, is essentially a no-good drunkard. Out of fairness to the community, the son is to be executed, because he will bring wickedness upon the innocents of that community. That is, he will, of course, harm others. He'll be a burden to his parents and to the community rather than as a contributing asset, as he was intended to be. What is fair in the arena of judicial punishment comes next, and it espouses the principle of proportionate punishment, lex talionis. That is, the punishment must be in proportion to the seriousness of the crime. And the hierarchy of the seriousness of crimes is ordered by God. Next, in chapter 22, is the matter of fairness when you see a neighbor's animal stray, that you alert him to it, and if you can, capture it and return it to him. That is, finders, keepers, losers, weepers is deemed by God as not fair. On and on it goes, even to the point of discussing fundamental fairness as concerns sexual behavior, especially deviant sexual behavior, and how it's defined. Chapter 23, the matter of what a poor person who is hungry might do to obtain food, is discussed within the boundaries of fairness. He may go into his neighbor's vineyard, eat some grapes to satisfy his hunger, but he can't take a basket with him and fill it up. The same goes for someone going into a grain field. Even the matter of fairness in divorce is dealt with. To open chapter 24, a man most certainly may become dissatisfied with his wife and divorce her, but as bad as this is, it must be done in a fair enough way to protect her from being thrown into poverty. A bit later comes the issue of fairness in money and business. The one who will need money the most is a poor person. But they will also necessarily have the least to offer as collateral. Thus, while it's fair to expect some collateral to guarantee that the loan will be paid back even from a poor person, the person doing the loaning cannot enter the borrower's home and forcibly take that collateral from them. However, the borrower is obligated to take that promised collateral outside and give it to the lender. On the other hand, if the collateral is something like the blanket that person needs to stay warm at night, because that may well be the only thing of value he owns, then that blanket must be held by the lender during the day, but it must be returned to the borrower before nightfall so he won't be cold. Towards the end of chapter 25, the issue of fairness in buying and selling is dealt with. The bottom line is this: there ought not be numerous or subjective or individually determined fairness standards. There's only one source that ought to be used to determine that standard. Doubly so for all believers: the law of Moses and the prophets. See, these are suitable for every culture in every era when one studies them sufficiently to understand the principles underlying each commandment. If one considers the law of Moses and the prophets as irrelevant to their life or their faith, then despite any claims to the contrary, they have left themselves with no objective standard of fairness other than the one they've invented in their own minds, which no doubt will evolve and re-evolve around whatever benefits them the most in any given situation, or perhaps whatever feels right to them at the time. There's a word for what this Torah-lessness approach to living in this world amounts to: sin.
For more teaching and information, visit us online today. Come and be a part of our fellowship. Here at The Seed, enjoy worshiping and learning God's Word with us.